Story Time with Stephanie Storey.
Hi, welcome to Story Time. I am your host, art historical novelist Stephanie Storey. And my guest today, I am very much looking forward to. She does not know this, but I have my own sort of personal relationship with the Civil War. So I am looking very forward to this conversation. My guest today is an expert in the Civil War. She's got, a degree from Harvard and a PhD in American Studies from Iowa and all kinds of things. She's written 3 books. Her latest is called Three-Cornered War, and it is about the Civil War from sort of the Western perspective, particularly the New Mexico territory. I have lots to ask her about. So welcome to the show, Dr. Megan Kate Nelson.
Thank you so much for having me. It is truly a delight.
Excellent. So I started this by saying I have this personal relationship with the Civil War.
Yes.
And here's what I mean by that. So I grew up in the American South.
Okay.
Educated in public school systems here, went to college at Vanderbilt in Nashville, Tennessee. So my perspective of the Civil War, it turns out, I did not know this growing up, was a very particular perspective on the Civil War. It was only when I got friends from up in New England and Connecticut and New York or California that I went, oh, I was taught one very particular version. So this version coming from the West is yet another version of the Civil War that blows my mind at how all of our perspectives are informed by which area of the country we grew up in. Why was this the Western story, the story you wanted to tell? Why do you think it's important to understanding the Civil War? Tell me those things.
Well, so like you, I had never heard of the war in this region. I had only really learned about Virginia, Gettysburg, Sherman's March. I had been to the Gettysburg battlefield, like in parts of Virginia. And I grew up in Colorado. And I never knew that there were battles in New Mexico, and I never knew that Colorado soldiers had a part in it. And in fact, a very large role, these gold miners recruited from up in the mountains. So that was actually the propelling force, is that when I was researching the Civil War history kind of more broadly for my previous book, which is also a Civil War book, but takes place totally in the Eastern Theater, I ran across these battles, Valverde and Glorieta Pass, and I started to look into things and started to look into, what the Union Army was doing with campaigns against Native people, and I was like, I have never heard of this before. I have never, growing up in Colorado, we got the kind of, and, I grew up there in the 70s and 80s. So this is like pre-multiculturalism, like the revolution of everything. And so we got the whole pioneers, silver mining, all of that kind of content. And we did get Indian wars, but not anything related to the Civil War. So I grew up thinking that the Civil War was not part of my kind of local history, when in fact, that's totally not true. And so that whenever historians kind of run into something where it's like, oh, I have never heard of this. Why have I never heard of this? That is like a golden moment, because then you're like, okay, I want to know what happened. And I also want to know why I never knew that this existed before. Those are sort of 2 different questions, but the first one sort of set me on the road to like try and figure out what actually was going on in the far West.
Okay, so I will ask both questions. So tell me first what was going on, and then I do want to know why no one covered it. But first, give me sort of the broad strokes of what this story is, so people watching at home know what they're getting into when they buy your book and read it.
So in the Three-Cornered War, which you can see behind me, but is also here in larger font, I tell the story of the Civil War in the far West. Most of the action takes place in New Mexico and what became Arizona territory. Arizona did not exist until the Civil War, and in fact was a Confederate territory initially. So there's your little trivia moment here, if you know people in Arizona. So it tells this whole story of how the Union and the Confederacy came to really struggle and fight over control of the far West. The reasons why they were there, they wanted it for its gold and for its Pacific ports, because as I think we all know, wars cost money. And the North had more money than the South had. And so for the Confederacy in particular, it was really important for them to try and get access to the gold, and then also to the port so they could ship out their cotton. Because the Union was already, by the first summer of the war, doing a pretty effective job at blockading their Atlantic, seaboard ports, and then also their Gulf ports. And so they needed an outlet. So this was one of the reasons, or these were two of the reasons why the Confederates invaded New Mexico in the summer of 1861 and tried to take the West for the Confederacy. Now, the Union, of course, wanted to keep it out of Confederate hands. And both sides actually saw the West as part of their larger future. So that, the Confederacy wanted the West not only for the money, but they also wanted it because they thought if they won the war, they would be a continental empire. They would have an empire of slavery from coast to coast. And they could use that to then expand southward into Mexico and the Caribbean and keep growing. And the Union had sort of the opposite image, although equally imperial, and they saw the Union as a coast-to-coast nation filled with free farmers. So the West, which was 40% of the nation's landmass at this point, that was a central part of their vision. And one of the interesting things to me has always been, I think we're really used to talking about the West and the Western territories in the whole run up to the war, right? Like this will be familiar to most people from their high school classes, or if they took classes in college, that this is part of the reason why Northerners and Southerners were fighting all the time in the 1850s is what are we going to do with these Western territories? Are they going to be free? Are they going to be slave? Can you take even if they're free territories, can you take your slaves to them and not lose them? And this was the wedge that was driving the North and South apart. And yet Civil War historians often act like, the firing on Fort Sumter happened and then the West doesn't matter anymore. That no one's thinking about the West at all anymore. And that is not the case, as the book argues.
It is really, I've already admitted to you that I have not finished the book, primarily because I'm taking my time with it, because I am so fascinated by the way being introduced to this changes the sort of the crystal, like which side of it you're looking at. How has this story, I'm stumbling, how has this story been skipped over and it doesn't register how enormous it was and how impactful it was? Why do you think it was missed? I mean, relative.
Yeah, I think there are a couple reasons for that. One is that Civil War historians have predominantly the work that they have done at the kind of beginning and the formation of the field was almost solely military history, and it was focused on the Eastern Theater. And so if you are only focused on battlefields and you're only interested in big battles that change the course of the war, have huge casualty rates, of course you're going to focus on the East. Mm-hmm. You might focus a little bit on the Trans-Mississippi, like where you grew up, like Shiloh and some of the battles in Franklin and Tennessee, but you're not going to be focusing on anything farther west than that. And you're also not going to be focusing, if you're only focusing on battles, you're not going to think about women. You're not going to think about people of color and enslaved men and women who are, choosing their own destinies at this point in time. You're not maybe thinking about politics very much, except for Lincoln. Like this is what happens when you only focus like on the Eastern battlefields. And that started to change kind of in the 80s and 90s. People started to kind of do social history and think more about like the war is not just about battle. Battles are only 5%, I think, of the time that soldiers spend. Even they're marching, they're building camps for themselves, they're trying to feed themselves, they're like doing all this other stuff. And so when you're focusing on the battlefield, it really is only this very kind of minuscule kind of way of seeing the war. So my purpose has always been to sort of broaden that scope. And one of the ways you do that is geographically. And then also one of the ways you do that is chronologically. And I think they're actually related. So the Three-Cornered War, actually, the time frame is 61 to 68, which is also a broader time frame than we are used to in the East, where it ends at Appomattox and then the war is over. But when you kind of move and you start to look at the war from a place, so far from Richmond and Washington, D.C., it gives you kind of new and different views. It gives you this sort of greater sense of the war as a truly continental conflict, that it involved the North and the South, but it also involved the West. And then also other interesting things start to happen, because then you have suddenly this army, this Union army, coalescing on the Rio Grande to combat this Confederate invasion. And that army is made up of professional soldiers who had been enlisted before the war and had been in frontier garrisons. These Colorado gold miners who volunteered from the diggings in the Rocky Mountains, Hispano civilians who made up the bulk of the army, who are defending their own home front against this invasion, and then Ute and Pueblo spies and scouts. So you have the most diverse army of the war fighting in the winter of 1862, like coming together in late 61 and then fighting in 62. And no one ever talks about this. This is more than a year before the first Black troops are put in the field, right? So if you're thinking about kind of armies and how they're made up and like who's actually fighting for the Union and why, this gives you a very different picture. And it also, you know, this is just one of the ways that, you know, kind of creating this different angle of vision really tells us something totally new about the war.
Where did your clear obsession, I mean, you've written 2 books, you've PhD in this stuff, clear obsession with the Civil War. Do you know where that came from? Like, why?
I mean, I actually was converted. And this is like the passion of the converted, right? Like, because my first book, I started off as a Southern environmental historian. So my first book is about the Okefenokee Swamp in Southern Georgia. And while I was mucking around in the swamp, I found ruins there. And so that led me to the Ruins Project, which initially was like a 19th century American ruins project. And then I was like, that's ridiculous. That is like way too broad. I need to narrow it down. And so I was like, well, what is the moment in American history that's created the most ruins in the landscape? And I was like, oh, the Civil War. And in fact, I had not ever taken a Civil War class. I had never taught a Civil War class. And this was a couple of years out of my PhD. So, but I think you find, and you probably found too, since you have this interest, once you start studying the Civil War, it's very hard to stop. And it's because it is such a foundational moment, and it involves so many people, and so many people wrote about it and reported on it and thought about it in the moment. So you have all of these amazing sources. You have photography coming to the fore at the same time. So we have these amazing images. We have illustrators on the field of battle. I mean, just an incredible moment in the evolution of American visual culture. And I think that was also very important in kind of conveying the meaning of the war to people. And so, you know, you start to hear these stories, and there's so many of them, and there's so many people engaged in so many different communities that really, I mean, this is why everyone jokes. They're like, oh God, another Civil War history. Like, haven't you written about it all? And I actually think it's impossible to write about it all. I mean, I don't think that I could ever in my lifetime read every primary document ever created during this moment. I don't think anybody could. And there are just so many interesting ways to think about it. And this is why this seems, I mean, there have been military historians who've written about this field, and their work was hugely important. And also Native American historians have written about this field and collected oral histories. And so that has been important, but there hasn't been, I mean, those two fields are really siloed. Like the Western history, Native American history, and Civil War history, there's almost no overlap. Like, anyone who does like both of those things or all of those things. And so this is the advantage I think I have as an American Studies PhD, is that I am very used to kind of crossing borders and mucking around in other people's fields and sort of saying, oh, what can I learn from art history? What can I learn from literature? What can I learn from like geological science? Like, what, which is a little harder, I will say. But you know, what can I learn from these other experts in these other fields, and really bring a new way of seeing this, what I think people really think of as a very well-known conflict, but then sort of reveal that it's actually not fully known.
How does knowing that much about the Civil War inform your take on where we are today and our politics of today and how we got here? how does that change it? And or how does your study of the West affect that particular prism you're looking through?
I mean, there's so much that we can track back, to the war and to the years before. When you look at a map, when you look at electoral maps, starting in the early 21st century, you are seeing the maps of the Union and the Confederacy. It's very eerie. Even though there have been like huge demographic shifts, like it's a very strange sort of consistency, or maybe it's not a consistency, maybe it's just like a reverberation. But I think that, basically every tension and every division and so much of inequality that we experience today tracks back even before the Civil War, of course, to the establishment of slavery, to the eradication of Native peoples, and this sort of imperial kind of white sense of entitlement that we've had in this country, and that you can also see in the Three-Cornered War. I mean, the Confederate invasion of the Southwest that's an imperial move, so it kind of puts the lie to the people, the kind of Confederate heritage people who were like, we were just defending our homes, so it kind of enters the Confederate monument debate, like, what do these things really mean? Recently Arizona, in Tucson, the Sons of Confederate Veterans were in this major parade and were, flying the Confederate flag. And a member of the city council was like, no, not going to do that anymore. And there was a big, kerfuffle over it. But really, like, the Confederate flag in Arizona makes a lot of sense, because that's what they were, that is where the Confederate flag kind of shows its truest colors, is that they were overtly trying to take the Southwest in order to expand the empire of slavery and to expand, the power of white people kind of throughout the country.
Yeah, see, as a child of the South, I was not taught that we were the invaders. That is not part of the history I was taught.
No. Did they call it the War of Northern Aggression?
They did when I was young. I mean, I like you, I'm a child of the 70s and 80s. So when I was young, and then that slowly started getting phased out.
Yeah.
And by the time I went to Vanderbilt and I met people from like Connecticut and New York, I was like, oh,
Yeah. And every community has its own understanding of that conflict, right? And they create a narrative to explain it. And for Native peoples who lived in the Southwest, for Apaches and Navajos, they're looking at this war and it's part of a larger pattern to them of colonial aggression, like first Spanish, then Mexican, then American aggression and incursions into their territories. And so they responded to it like they responded to all of the conflicts that had come before. They exploited it, they negotiated, sometimes they fought. They had a very kind of flexible range of responses. And so the Civil War becomes, for those communities, a very important moment, but it has a different valence, it kind of enters their histories in a different kind of way, and they understand it differently. But this is what makes it so fascinating. And I will say, like, for this particular moment, like the pandemic moment.
That's what I was going to ask about.
Yeah, what has become super clear to me. So there's one of the protagonists, there are 9 people the reader follows in the book. And one of them is this guy, James Henry Carleton, who is actually a frustrated novelist. Well, no, he was not successful. He couldn't get a book published. He was from Maine. He wanted to be a novelist. In fact, I mean, this is like crushing. Like, you think of something you might have done, like, as a sort of young person in pursuit of your dream, and you're like, oh, because he sent a writing sample and a letter to Charles Dickens. And he was like, I really want to be a novelist. Will you please read my writing and tell me if I can be a novelist? And if so, can I come to England and hang out with you? Like, that was the gist of the letter. Yeah. So he got this very nice, Dickens was very nice, which, he could be super mean. So this was unusual. And he just was kind of like, do you have a day job? Because don't quit it. Because really, I think you should put your talents to other uses. And so Carleton joined the military. So we actually have Dickens to thank for all of the Carleton like management and mismanagement that occurred afterward. But he was a career military guy, and he brought 2,000 soldiers from Los Angeles to the Rio Grande, just an unbelievable distance, more than 800 miles, all, staggering them along the way. He trained them for months and months and months to do this. Logistically, it was this unbelievable feat because he did not lose one soldier to disease or exposure or anything. But then this same man who managed to do that, to move that many men over that distance, he took command of the Department of New Mexico. And and his whole goal was, force Navajos and Apaches to surrender, move them to this reservation, try to Americanize them while surveilling and controlling them. Somehow, like, his unbelievable logistical skills in this moment shifted, and he just mismanaged everything. He had no idea how many Native peoples might surrender, so he was completely unprepared. He did not have any food for them when they arrived, like in the spring of 1864. He had put, his officers who had checked out Bosque Redondo, the site of it, had said, this is not a great place for a reservation. Like, we should move it upstream. And he was like, no. And in fact, it was a nightmare. It was like the worst possible place to like put this critical density of people. And when I think about that, and I think about the role of logistics and what's going on now, and how it's so important to have people who are experienced at logistics, who can, have all the connections, can marshal all the supplies. When you either mismanage it or your logistical skills just fail you because you're in a different context. He was no longer protecting his soldiers, right? He was conquering Native people. It created one of the worst like humanitarian crises in the Civil War. And so that, to me, I think one of the major elements that has, there are so many things that explain how this pandemic has just gone completely haywire and just shoved our country sideways. But one of those is the failure of logistical command. And Carleton sort of taught me that, which is really interesting. I didn't think that's a very hardcore like military history thing, logistics. And I never thought I was going to be that historian who was like, well, how many kegs of flour did they bring? Did they have enough wagons? But it really is hugely important. And when you have a crisis like this, where there are many thousands of people who need help, who are vulnerable, like, you have to have people in leadership who are skilled and experienced and want to help the people that they need to help,
So if your story that you just published has changed your perspective on this moment, how do you perceive this moment is going to change what you're going to be writing about moving forward, having lived through this pandemic?
Yeah, so the next project is a little bit of a sequel to the Three-Cornered War. It's the story of the 1871 Yellowstone Survey, which was a government-funded scientific survey of Yellowstone, which led directly to the passage of the 1872 Yellowstone Act, which created the first national park in the world. Again, it is like the Three-Cornered War, a story about federal power, and as it kind of comes to clash with state and local power and local communities. It's also about ways of knowing, the scientific kind of idea that, Hayden basically wanted to go in. Yellowstone had been, people had been there, Native people had obviously been there, and then fur trappers and some other explorer types and some gold miners had also been there. But no one had systematically surveyed it before. So Hayden had a team of, 20-something scientists with him. And their goal was to come to know Yellowstone in order to control it, right? In order to control it and order it and map it and kind of bring it into the country. And so I find that, I mean, all of those are kind of in tension. The sort of what can be known, what is unknowable, and then the exertion during Reconstruction of this federal power to kind of bring, for projects that are meant to bring the country together, but what they actually do is they reveal that the country is still very much torn apart.
Okay, anyway, I could have talked to you for the next
I know!
year. This is great. Because you're a history nerd and I love the Civil War, and I could like sit here and listen to your Civil War stories all day. Okay, but I am going to let you go. This was fabulous. I am thoroughly enjoying your book. Anybody who's interested in the Civil War, really, it will change your lens on it, which is fascinating. Because as you said, there's so much written. It is fascinating to get to something that has so changed my viewpoint on it. I just loved it. So
Story time with Stephanie Storey. Story time virtually. We've got time and plenty of stories, talking stories in a novel way. Story time with Stephanie Storey.